So I'm here with Reema Maya, who's at her second Sundance Film Festival. I'm looking at your cinema. It's a cinema that's rooted in social realism, activism. There's a political text, there's a political subtext. You dig into plights of women of all ages in a very hostile world, where being of your gender is sometimes you're considered second-class citizens, and your films deal with that as bullshit on some level. So what I appreciated having seen your previous 2018 film and Nocturnal Burger is that you don't victim blame, you don't shame, and you don't villainize, making for a very powerful cinema. So this is why we're speaking today, because I was really touched by your film. So first off, congrats on winning the lottery not once but twice. This is a big fucking deal. And you rise above 10 to 11,000 submissions. It's a major accomplishment in itself. I wanted to get a sense, before plunging into Nocturnal Burger, I wanted to get a sense of where you situate yourself in the ecosystem that is Indian cinema, but also short films in your country. What's the rapport with the public? Are you able to give access to people and showcase your work, not only video and commercial work, but is there a conversation that you're able to have with people from your very large country?
When it comes to, I guess I situate myself in a small little bubble that is independent filmmaking in India, which is a huge country with lots of really big film industries. But within that, the independent film scene is very, very small. And within that, the independent short filmmaking scene is minuscule.
It's micro inside a micro.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I feel like for most people, they're looking at making short films as just as something you do to move on to something else. But I really enjoy, I've always been pretty medium agnostic and format agnostic. So I really enjoy the challenge that comes with what is the story you can really tell compellingly in something that is less than 30 minutes, less than 40 minutes, less than 20 minutes. And I think that's a really exciting challenge, which is why I really enjoy this genre. Is there enough space for conversation about short films and independent shorts in India? Unfortunately, not enough, not nearly enough. There are, of course, a lot of people who enthusiastically host short film screenings and try to have more conversation, but there's so few and far in between. And there isn't really a big festival that supports.
I hear you.
Yeah, short films and
well, thankfully your cinema travels, and people that have no understanding or perception of the realities in your country have access to that. Of course, I read about all the traumatizing events that do occur in your country, and I think your way into discussing things is really, really interesting. I read that for Nocturnal Burger, the short is based on a real-life trauma of being you were essentially a bystander to something that you saw, very familiar to what we see in this film. At what point did you understand that this needed to be a film instead of a personal experience? At what point what's the entry point into you thinking, oh, I'm gonna put this into the language of cinema?
I think the inciting incident is inspired from something that happened a couple of years ago, and it was a very heavy night that didn't leave me. When you go through something intense, you either really talk about it a lot, or you just internalize it, and it just exists within you, but there's this blanket of silence around it. I always found that I needed to have that conversation, but words just did not seem enough to really talk about everything that happened that night. The decision to make this a film is, it was very instinctive when the conversation was, okay, want to make another film, what should it be? This is the first thing that came, and it just kept coming and coming. And I was trying to explore like multiple ideas and stories, but this one just was the first one, and it kept coming back, and it was the one that I felt most strongly about. And there's a specific reason for that. Growing up in India, me and most of the people around me, male or female, have gone through a lot of, like, at least one, if not several, instances of sexual abuse as a kid. It is extremely prevalent, and there is, again, a lot of silence around it. And that means that, you know, either you as a kid don't realize what happened to you, but you can still feel the impact of it, or you realized it and you tried to tell an adult and they didn't listen to you, they didn't believe you. And if they believed you, they didn't do anything about it. Very, very rarely, like, I can't think of actually a single person that I know who's come to me and said, yeah, I went through something like that and I got some semblance of justice. So it's just something that you end up living with for the rest of your life. And what was important about this night was two things. The biggest one was that this kid gets some semblance of instant justice, where she literally sees the society come in, intervene, and punish, make it very clear that it was not her fault. And I thought that was rare, and it doesn't happen. And this was the one night where I saw it happen before my eyes, and it felt like this collective catharsis of like years of having to go through that, not just for me but for so many people that I know. So I thought that was really significant. And the second thing was, I was talking to a friend of mine who had been working with an NGO that deals with CSA, and I said, what's the solution? Like, what do we do? And she said, the only thing you can do is community intervention. Like, if you see something happening, you have to intervene and you have to stop it, because too many people turn a blind eye and they don't realize how much worse it's going to get if you look away right now.
Yes.
And I thought that is exactly the point that this film and this story makes, which is pretty simply, at the end of everything, if you see something happening, please intervene, because it might be way worse without you intervening.
Let's talk about so I calculated 4 female protagonists, because there's one that's sort of like the adult and the child version of it, and I really like the casting choices. Like, again, maybe it's silly on my part, but the one who's super protective of her, and the one that sort of is in the police constable. There's this, I want to say how it's women helping each other. There's a sisterhood built to protect, but it's a non-verbal thing.
Yeah.
And that, I really like that about your film. I thought it was refreshing. But I like how you constructed those two characters, how they look like. You know, I was just wondering how you thought of those two specific women characters, and like how did you come to casting them specifically?
I mean, the first decision was, you know, whether I make this story as a story with only one protagonist, or I make it a story with multiple protagonists, each of whom is exploring a different aspect of abuse and trauma and its consequences. So the reason there are 4 with the childhood and adult version of Simi is because through Minu's character, I wanted to explore the immediate effects, the immediate consequences of abuse or trauma. Through Simi's character, we understand the long-term and long-lasting consequences of something that happened, 20 years ago, how it can still haunt you on an everyday basis. And through the constable Sarita's character, I wanted to explore the chronic consequences of trauma, right? Of something that you are constantly exposed to every day for a long period of time. How that changes you and your ability to deal and to empathize and sympathize and help yourself and others. So I think that was why I chose to have 3 main protagonists, and a lot of subjectivity in everybody else. And in terms of the casting choice, I knew that I wanted the establishment to be from where the film is set, and I wanted everybody else to feel like an outsider who doesn't belong. So Minu and her family are from northern India. They are immigrants from northern India. Simi is from northeast India, who also go through a lot of judgment and racism in the rest of the country. Especially in Maharashtra, there has been a lot of Maharashtrians versus North Indian conflict going on. So it's very significant in the way that this kid is being treated by the police officers. The trans women that are there, of course, are treated as the ultimate other, are extremely ostracized and extremely, mistreated. It's, again, by the establishment on an everyday basis. And for Sarita, so I very consciously made casting choices to make it really obvious that these are all considered the others.
Yes.
And it was also important to make the point that even within the establishment, you're still the other, right? Which is the female cop, because the gender is what comes into play there. So apart from the main male cop, who is, from the state, from the city, heterosexual man in position of power, everybody else in every frame you see are all outsiders.
We begin the short in the dark. Essentially what that does, it commands our attention. And we hear this casual exchange where a young girl is forced to correct the language. When we scale back, we learn that that little girls are unsafe. And essentially, I wanted to say that I was thinking of you as a filmmaker, and you're almost like a social, I wanted to say a detective in a way. And this film is very much that. We find out that there's a connection and there's a root for why she's in that position. I thought that was a really strong statement.
I think one big and obvious part of it is that you can't have a conversation about CSA without talking about the idea of grooming, because that's what happens with most children, where they are lured with promises and compliments, and they are love bombed and showered with affection, and that's why this child puts their guards down and becomes that much more vulnerable to this very emotionally manipulative adult. And it's that the emotional manipulation is as disgusting, if not more, I think, because it's really scarring, and that is what confuses the children, about almost making it feel like they were participants, or they willingly participated in what was happening. And that's it's horrible, and it's really disgusting. So I thought it was important to start with that, with a background of why that night was made possible, why she even sat in the rickshaw in the first place. And the second thing also is that with this particular film, I wanted the audience to be an active participant throughout, from the beginning to the end, which is why in the beginning, you're just hearing voices and you have to kind of piece it together that it's an adult and a child having this conversation, and it's a seemingly harmless conversation. It's just them talking about the semantics of a compliment. You're beautiful. No, oh, do you mean cute? No, not cute. Beautiful. That's it. There's nothing seems dangerous about it, but when you think about it for a couple of seconds more, it really hits you what's happening. It is this adult giving a very adult compliment to a kid who has never heard it before, and then you start figuring out and start piecing things together. So I thought it was important to put the audience in an active position right from the beginning, so they know what kind of engagement is expected through the rest of the film. And I think that was also an important moment for Meenu's character, because she's the oldest of 4 or 5 daughters, and she's being pushed into a very parental role so early on in her life, and she's clearly neglected and she doesn't get the affection that she deserves. And in the middle of all that, this man, who clearly can see that she's vulnerable in that sense, comes and gives her attention and calls her beautiful. Nobody has ever called her beautiful, and so you start understanding and empathizing with her right from the beginning.
Of course. You have fantasy sequences in this film that serve as decoders of possible dangers. There's her thinking about the negative reaction from her father. there's the pile of burgers that again, that goes back to the attention that she's receiving. But there's also the day where the protector is blanketing herself with a security blanket in a way on the beach. I thought that was a really powerful scene, and I imagine this is part of like I was saying before we spoke, is that you are doing a lot of commercial work, video work. So I was thinking like fantasy is a really important element in your cinema. Am I?
Yes.
So what is that something that's really important for you into discussing, which are really larger, difficult subject matters?
I think, again, with something like sexual abuse, so much of it, even though one would imagine it's physical abuse, so much of it is psychological, and it really leaves some deep psychological scars. And there are two aspects to how these things are made to happen and be dealt with, right, by our psyche, which is fantasy, which are the promises, and escapism, which are the coping mechanisms that we use to just deal with these memories. So that was why I chose the treatment that we did, which is, for me, every time someone is talking about about what actually happened, she's escaping to whatever her safe space is in that moment. And right at the beginning, it's that one moment of shared empathy she feels with the trans women who are sitting there. And I don't know if you've experienced this or not, but I feel like when you go through something traumatic, you almost get inducted into this empathy club, which is unsaid. You can look at someone across a room and you know that they've gone through something that you've gone through, even though you know nothing about them. And it's a very powerful thing, this moment of unsaid empathy and solidarity between survivors. So that was the moment of her kind of becoming a part of that community. And apart from that, every time Simi hears someone say something about the event, she of course gets triggered, and her memories come rushing back. So that was sort of the narrative reason why those sequences were there. But as a filmmaker, I also made a very conscious decision to do that, because I wanted to make sure I don't show or talk about any abuse at all, because I did not want to fetishize something that we're critiquing. And it was really important to just convey enough about the abuse but not go into any details. So anytime anybody starts talking about exactly what happened, we kind of cut away to a different space.
And which brings us to really, when we go back into one specific conversation between the constable and her protector, is that the constable says, more or less, the idea is that we shouldn't have to lie to tell the truth. It's so fucked up and backwards as a society, but in this case, the constable understands that nothing's going to happen without fibbing, I guess. So I thought that was a really interesting answer, because exactly, you unfetishize that by not including it. I thought that was a really powerful choice there.
And it's the conversation of idealism versus practicality, right? Of course, we know what the laws are, and we know that police officers are supposed to go through sensitivity training and all these things that exist on paper, but do they really exist on ground? Like the fact that you have to, you can file a 0 FIR anywhere. But I feel like every single time I have gone to the police station for a complaint, there has been a long conversation about whose jurisdiction it comes under. So there are these things that exist to help us, that have been thought through, and but they mostly exist in theory. And when you go out into the big bad world, you realize that your idealism and your armchair activism doesn't stand for shit. What was the last kernel of an idea that got put into this short? What is one element that you introduced that sort of became like an eureka moment? It was I think, the script went through a couple of different versions, and it was a little bit more linear and it was a bit simpler because, there is an obvious villain and there is an obvious victim. But I think the big moment of transformation for the film was when we decided to explore the idea of unreliable narrators and the subjectivity that their own, past experiences and traumas bring to the table and how they understand and what they believe or they don't believe. I think that was the decision where, like, in every character, there are lots of shades that are happening. If you choose to look at someone as a victim, you'll be able to look at them as a victim, and if you choose to look at someone as a villain, you'll be able to look at them as a villain. And this is, I think, true for all the characters. So I think that really was the transformation.
The film does go beyond face surface. There's a lot more complexities into what they're thinking, how they're acting. I'm going to end off with this question. Thank you so much for your time. So I imagine you're working on different film ideas, and you'll probably see what takes off first. Maybe it's another short, maybe it's a feature, who knows. But without naming any specific projects or anything like that, what are some themes or genres or ideas that are right now important for you and that you're thinking of exploring?
Yeah.
Being at a festival like Sundance, you're perhaps engaged with other filmmakers and other films. So right now, it's just like you're perhaps in a really rich creative space right now. So what are some of those things that matter to you?
Yeah, I think talking about repression, especially coming from India and trying to bring Indian stories to the global stage, the idea of repression is really important to me to explore, because it's one of those, like, I know I want to make socially conscious cinema, and the thing about social change is you first have to make people aware that there's a problem that requires changing. And I think that's the space that my next film will be in. There is a really exciting script that I'm developing, working on, among others. But this one is kind of an outlandish social drama with kind of climate change backdrop, and represents Mumbai as like a contemporary technological dystopia version of Mumbai. But the conversation still is of that, like, human condition of mental enslavement and abusive relationships. So I'm really interested in social commentary, but through a more idiosyncratic gaze, and through comedy and through satire that helps us just see how ridiculous a lot of those situations are.
Thank you, Reema, for your time, and congratulations on Nocturnal Burger. I'm going to be promoting this for the next year ahead. Make sure they get into a lot of film festivals, and let's wish you a great creative year ahead. Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.